Welcome to the fourth in a series of talks on Wesley's Britain by Jeremy Black, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Exeter and a visiting fellow with us in the Oxford Centre for Methodism and Church History. Professor Black is one of Britain's most distinguished historians and its most prolific, having written more than 150 books. Professor Black's primary expertise is in the 18th century, so he's well placed to give us a view of Wesley's Britain. In this fourth talk, he's going to discuss print, authorship and publication in Wesley's Britain. So Jeremy, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. Can I start off by saying that I really don't want to repeat in this or indeed any of the other lectures or talks that I give anything that I've covered in my books, because obviously some people have read those books, and if not, they should jolly well go and read them. So there are 3 books on newspapers with the imaginative titles of the English press in the 18th century. It's the first one. Then the English press 1621 to 1861. That was the second one. And then the third one was just boldly and baldly called the English press. So for example, I'm the first one. There is a section on religious publications in the 18th century. Those are periodical publications specifically on religious matters, and I don't want to repeat that. People can look at that themselves, or if they choose not to, that's up to them. What I rather want to do is, again, as with the previous one, draw attention to some of the conceptual and methodological points about the press that's worth considering. And in doing so, as with the first one, I want to put a sort of question mark against the usual assumption about the press, which is an assumption which is an aspect of, if you like, the kind of public space theory of the 18th century. The idea that the 18th century created public spaces which were inherently radicalizing, indeed often radical, and democratic, indeed often democratizing, and that this culminates in almost inevitable movements for change from the late 18th century onwards. I think one has to be very careful. I've argued that in the first of our talks. I'll argue it again here. The press and publications as a whole were a medium, not a message. I think that's the key point I wish to make. Having said that, I could end this, but I think I feel I need to gloss it a bit. And as a medium, they represented themselves change. I mean, obviously there is change. There is change in the shape of printing, which had begun in Britain in the late 15th century. There is the change in the form of periodical publications, which had begun in Britain in the early 17th century. And then there was change in the shape of the end of pre-publication censorship, which dates from the 1690s, the lapsing of the Licensing Act. And then, of course, you can link to that, if you wish, though the links are often indirect, the evolution of particular types of newspaper. So at the very beginning of the 18th century, you have the first of the daily newspapers, the Daily Courant in 1701. You have the first provincial newspapers. By the beginning of the 1780s, you have the first Sunday newspapers, and again, so on and so forth. So you can very much see change in the form of the development of an industry. That is not the same as change as having automatic flows in terms of necessary impact on individuals. And here we could tell a little story, and that is what I think is a very quaint story of Dr. Johnson going to use the library at Queen's House, and the most famous resident of Queen's House, who is who, Bill?
It's George III.
Well done. And George III asking if he can go and see Dr. Johnson, and Dr. Johnson George allowed his library to be used by visitors. Dr. Johnson very kindly saying he would agree to receive the king, and the two men have a conversation as recorded, and the conversation is about their favourite literature. And the favourite literature, do you remember what they talk about?
I can't remember, Jeremy. No, you'll have to tell me.
You must read my George III. Their conversation is about books, 17th century books of sermons. George III and Dr. Johnson regarding novels as very frivolous indeed, compared to books of sermons, though Dr. Johnson himself was aware of novels, obviously, as you know, he wrote one. But I think what that captures is what one shouldn't be surprised about. Indeed, it's what we all know about in the particular interest of this centre, that far from being necessarily radical and political and democratic, in fact, much of the press in terms of publication, but not just in terms of book publication, pamphlet publication, ephemera publication, woodcuts, were devoted to often quite conventional and conservative accounts, not that one should see religion necessarily as conventional or conservative, but conventional and conservative accounts of moralistic tales of a religious type, aspects of the creed, accounts of co-religionists abroad, etc., etc. And much that we think about in radical terms, in fact, emerges from that literature. Abolitionism, for example, the movement to abolish the slave trade very much comes out of that background of a religious and committed literature, rather than of some sort of modern account of the rights of man, whatever those might or might not be understood to be. The rights of men, or men understood as including women, in the 18th century were principally conceived of in terms of the right to try and pursue your opportunities for salvation. And that was one of the major critiques of the slave trade, that it so debased human beings that it made that not easy or possible. But you know, what one has to get away from is the idea that there is a clear-cut political message in the press. Now, let's move on from that, because I think that's a fairly obvious point. I don't think we really need to labour that. And we also need to consider, again, going forward from the discussion of literacy, which we offered in the first of our talks, whether we might well have exaggerated the scope, scale, and intensity of the public space, whatever we think about the composition of it in a non-ecclesiastical fashion. And I make that point because obviously the prime public space is the church. In every community, that is the prime, and it's the one in which access is easiest, it is free, it is expected, it is socially normative, etc., etc. But if one moves away from that to, as it were, pay for social spaces, which are also largely literacy dependent. I've already mentioned you could have newspapers read to you, as they sometimes were read aloud in public spaces, pubs. If you go to the pay for public space, one shouldn't necessarily assume that this is full of people starring in some prelude to a Gladstonian idyll about a public library in, shall we say, Middlesbrough. Instead of that, it's quite clear from accounts, and some of these are given wonderful novelistic finishes. One can think of Smollett's accounts of Scots people ending up in London, in which public spaces are for gambling, drinking, wenching, prostitution, not for the sober discussion of Bolingbroke or others' views on political thought. That, again, should not really surprise us, although you might be forgiven if you read some of the literature, scholarly literature on the period, if you imagined that in fact, that is what people spent their time doing in these public spaces. But what one can actually argue, if one wants to look at an economic approach, is to go back to a book by Cranfield. Cranfield and Wiles separately wrote 2 books in the 1680s on the development of the provincial press in the first half of the 18th century. And they used, in effect, or they pointed out that, in effect, alongside the story of expansion, you could look at it the other way round and say there was market saturation for particular periods, this market saturation being not really surprising because the real price of publications were pushed up by stamp duty, and stamp duty rose progressively from its inception at the latter stage of Queen Anne's reign, and rose far above the rate of inflation. So there's that point to bring out. There is and of course, when you've got a lot of consumer products not taxed, the stamp duty effect is noticeable. We have got the constraint already referred to by literacy. We've got the constraint which one could focus on, that the cost of distribution of books and newspapers outside the metropolis was such that, again, you might have assumed a more limited social penetration of the market than you've got in the metropolis, though that could be standing it on its head. Why necessarily should you assume a universal penetration of the market? After all, if one looks around us in modern society, I mean, it may well be the case where you're in university at Oxford, Bill, that there is a universal readership of the press with people making informed comments in which they essentially reproduce whatever they've read that morning in the Guardian or the Telegraph. But I would actually hazard a guess that even in Oxford that isn't true, and it certainly isn't true in these dark corners of Devon, which still reside in a kind of, you know, she stoops to conquer muddy disorder. So you've got that element to think about. And again, if you want to contrast the press, if you want to think about what happened to the press in the 1860s onwards, partly to do with the ending of the taxation, which finally ended in 1861, but also to do with other factors, the prosperity of the 1860s, growing literacy, mass education, the technology of steam-driven production techniques, and not just the printing, but all sorts of things, production of newsprint, for example, then you actually get newspapers of real scale, culminating, of course, in the 1890s with the Daily Mail. And then what you can not but think, compared to that, is how paltry the public space was in terms of the scale of publication in the 18th century, which is not, of course, what most 18th centurists want to think about. As far as books are concerned, again, every novel is interesting. I certainly find 18th century novels interesting, though some of them are quite wearisome in their sentiment. But every novel is interesting. But again, it's quite, you know, there are not all that many being published in the 18th century. Many of them that are published are reprints, of course. But there are not all that many of them being published. And again, the contrast with the late 19th century is instructive. So maybe what we ought to be doing is, instead of proclaiming, and here we, as it were, take up a theme from our second talk on economic change, instead of proclaiming revolutionary change in the 18th century, maybe we should be arguing that it is more appropriate to think of the 19th in that light. Bill.
Well, Jeremy, those are some very interesting observations. Of course, John Wesley, taking up your first point about publication and print, was about the medium, not the message. Of course, for John Wesley, the message was vitally important. He was only interested in publication as a tool for evangelicalism. And I guess in that sense, he's probably unrepresentative in most people who are involved commercially in publications. Is that the case?
Well, again, I think one has to be careful here. The extent to which publication was subsidized by, and the subsidy being related to other goals, political, religious, economic, for example, is worthy of note. So I think one has to be wary of crudely, I'm not saying you're being crude, but clearly juxtaposing a kind of economic motivation of the market, as in when we were talking about international relations and realism, and a kind of ideological commitment, and we talk about those as idealism. I think there was a considerable overlap in practical terms.
Yes, I mean, Wesley is undoubtedly a print entrepreneur in some respects. He clearly sees that sermons, and in particular hymnals, sell extraordinarily well. And indeed, even by the 1770s, he is reliant on income from sale of sermons and hymnals as his principal source of income. But of course, he's also sophisticated in having a distribution network through his preachers, who get saddlebags full of books to be sold when they go on their circuits and in itineration between places. So he has a very, a much more sophisticated and developed business model, so to speak, than the ordinary bookseller or printer, I suppose.
Yes, I think that that is probably true. I think that that's, although I think you'd find if you looked at the distribution system for provincial newspapers, the overwhelming number of which were weekly, there was one bi-weekly in Kent, but they're really weekly, you would find that they're quite complex distribution systems. So I wouldn't put Wesley as a unique figure in that respect. I mean, obviously, he's thinking in terms of moving beyond the conventional parochial structure, and that is interesting. I wouldn't say that is unique. I mean, think back to the extent to which Wesley, in some respects, is repeating the Puritan organization of the late 18th century.
Yes. I mean, of course, he's also involved in serial publications as well as books, because with the Arminian magazine and the Methodist magazine, he's clearly developing, again, a new market for recurrent literature, monthly literature, which in some ways kind of is meant to build up a body of items that you have in your house. So the Arminian magazine always has a frontispiece, which is a portrait of a notable preacher. And the stories of conversion is clearly meant to impact on the individual who is reading it in their home, and is intended to kind of hold up an example for their behavior. So he has this this entrepreneurial ability to think in terms of books, tracts, pamphlets, and serial publications, and that seems to me to be probably going beyond what most booksellers and most printers and publishers are doing.
Yes, I think that's right. And I did write about the Arminian magazine in my book on the 18th century press, or from what I remember I did. In fact, I know I did.
Yes, you did.
I think you are right. I mean, there is that element, and I think it's fair to say it exemplifies the way in which religious groups, and he is not unique in this, but is particularly significant in this, religious groups have a range that is different and an intensity that is different to that of political movements, much of which are episodic to particular general election campaigns, and or as with, say, you know, the Yorkshire Association, to particular political crises.
Yes, can I turn now to authorship? Because I think this is something you touch on in your work on John Wesley's concise history, that I think in the 21st century, we tend to have a sort of a single model of the author writing and producing their own work, whereas what it seems to me Wesley is doing is partly editing existing work. He's synthesizing his own comments with snippets and pieces that he gets from other books. So there's a kind of editorial sort of coordinating role as well as writing role in terms of what he's doing.
Well, I think that's a very good point. I mean, what I would argue is that in the case of histories of England, there is a kind of exegetical approach. In other words, you have established texts from the past, which particularly, of course, are clashing Tory and Whig views from the generation prior to Wesley. And you, as it were, take items out and episodes out and you gloss them. As it were, it's a sort of Talmudic approach to the past, approach also seen in other cultures. And to us, with the idea that that is not an appropriate way to proceed, you know, this seems wrong, though in practical terms, if you look at it, a lot of people writing today, particularly popular works, take polished, well-known episodes and simply repurpose them.
Yes, that's very much the sort of the idea behind his Christian library, isn't it? You put together sources from the past which other people would want to read and which he recommends as worthy publication. Really.
Yes, I think there's a lot of that. I think that, you know, I mean, I was very struck, as you know, I've written this book on history and the historians in the 18th century, and I was very struck. They don't write in accordance with the, as it were, scientific, and I'm putting that in inverted commas, account of history developed on the model of Ranker and then propagated in British universities, particularly Manchester, which had a comparable role to Chicago in the United States. But in many senses, we've gone round to becoming much more similar to the 18th century now. I mean, if you look at a lot of many academics' account of the past, a lot of it is to do with public myths. You can see that in the treatment of issues such as empire or slavery, in which what they validate something in a way that isn't necessarily based on source criticism. And I think that you've also got to be cautious of assuming that in the 18th century there wasn't a willingness and an ability to engage with differing accounts. I mean, you've referred to Wesley's History of England. As you know, Wesley writes at some length on it, about the relationship between Elizabeth Tudor, Elizabeth I, and Mary Queen of Scots. Now, I would argue that Wesley's account is, to put it mildly, problematic. But if you were to compare it to Hilary Mantel, you would say it's positively scholarly. So one's got to be very careful about where one's, you know, judgment range is coming from.
Yes, in fact,
I'm not implying that Hilary Mantel wrote about Elizabeth I and Mary Tudor. She didn't. All I'm saying is her idea that she was inspired by the spirit of Thomas Cromwell makes Wesley look like a positive rationalist.
Yes, Wesley has very distinct views about, well, for example, Richard III, doesn't he? He's certainly Ricardian. He certainly is.
But of course, he's not unique in that.
No.
I mean, you will know that there is all sorts of 18th century writers, Horace Walpole, for example, have views on Richard III. And the other thing...
He has a similarly heroic view of Mary Queen of Scots, doesn't he?
Yes. I mean, one of the things I think one can fairly say is that there isn't a kind of postmodernism there. In other words, if you are a faker, as arguably Macpherson is with Ossian and Chatterton is, and they're not unique, then you can expect to be called out. There isn't a sense that it's, you know, I can't remember what immortal phrase the Duchess of Sussex has added to academic exegesis, but the idea of my truth is everybody's truth kind of thing. That is not one that would have commanded much assent in the 18th century. In fact, it would have been regarded in many respects as a kind of sign of a rather dangerous narcissistic religious enthusiast who was claiming a direct relationship with the deity as opposed to any intermediary leadership by any religious figure of authority. One's got to be careful here reading from the 21st century to the 18th century and back again, but all I'm trying to say is that the 18th century did have an idea of the scrupulous nature of truth. Some of the historical writing and argument can appear curious, or downright wrong, but that does not mean that they didn't have an awareness of the idea of accuracy as opposed to inaccuracy.
Yes, indeed. I was thinking also of John Wesley's comments on Charles II, who he describes as the worst English king, which I think probably flies in the face of much of the 18th century interpretation of the Restoration and the idea of Charles II as a merry monarch. That here is John Wesley attacking him as the worst English king seems out of place in some respects.
Well, in some respects, and this is very interesting, given people's wranglings about and you can't expect individual writers to have a consistency. You know, people are allowed to have differing views, but in some respects, this is classic Whiggery. It's a sort of moral Whiggery. Charles II is the man who, you know, who persecuted the Whig martyrs, you know, the Rye House plot. He's the man responsible for James II getting on the throne, etc., etc. He was a perverse individual who was willing to sell the Protestant inheritance to a Catholicizing, evil French monarch. So in some respects, it's quite interesting there. So that you've got bad kings, as it were, in inverted commas in the Middle Ages, Edward II, say, or Richard II, but they weren't going to turn the country in the wrong direction theologically.
Yes, I think that's very interesting that Wesley brings that theological and religious lens to history. The final point to end on, Jeremy, is it seems to me that Wesley is also very acute when it comes to spotting not fakes, but what he sometimes describes as padding. He, I think, famously refers to Robertson's book on the Emperor Charles V as shockingly padded because it runs to 3 volumes and really doesn't say anything very much. And again, that suggests a degree of sophistication in what he expected of a book covering the life and reign of Charles V. Is that level of sophistication common, do you think?
Oh, I think you've got to be very careful there, Bill. You'll get into trouble for attacking a Scottish intellectual figure from the past. I mean, you're allowed to attack Hume because of his one comment, but you're not allowed to go for Robertson. I think there would obviously have been, in writing about Robertson, as well, a religious perspective. Both of these are clerics, of course, within a shall we say, crowded field of the clerical ego. Can we say that?
Yes.
That doesn't offend too many people. If not, so what? If so, I mean, so what? I think that, yes, there can be padding to get your works to the 3 volumes. I wouldn't myself like to hazard I've read Robertson, but many years ago, and I wouldn't myself like to hazard a view as to whether it was padded. I don't know enough about the genesis of that particular work. Shall we say that there was a lot to cover with Charles V and the significance of writing about Charles V? I mean, usually Robertson is cited these days because of his argument that the invasion of Italy by the French in 1494 augured in modernity. But obviously, that's not what made him significant as a subject for 18th century Brits. What made him significant as a subject is that he was the monarch when Luther proclaimed the Reformation.
Yes, indeed, yes.
And that is what really is, and for that matter, he's in command at Mühlberg when the Schmalkaldic League of Protestants is smashed, etc., etc. So that is, and in a sense, you can want to take this carefully, but in a sense, Charles V has, as it were, the original sin of the Reformation, because when the light is proclaimed by Luther, Charles V, who has the chance of listening to Luther at the Diet of Worms in 1521, as in fact backtracks and goes on a Catholicizing route, which ends the possibility of a peaceful redemption of the Christian world. So I think you could fairly say that there is an underlying, very strong ecclesiastical moral line there that possibly deserves more consideration. But again, I'm not a Robertson specialist, and I'm very happy to be told I'm wrong.
Jeremy, that's a very interesting observation, and I'm going to leave it there. So thank you very much indeed.
What I'm trying to do in podcasts is not simply to repeat books. What I am trying to do is to add to them. So I would hope that listeners are encouraged not only to read mine, but to read other works. There is many good books published on the 18th century, and I would hope people would read them and think about them and reflect on them. Thank you very much.